How it seems when we think of 100 years since the end of World War I, and it was so-called the war to end all wars, was it not? And how still, to this day, there's wars going on. And the Bible is very clear, even in Gideon's time, was it not? That war was going on back then as well. And people were living in fear. People were concerned, and yet, in the midst of that, God called people who were very unlikely to do very heroic acts. And He still is doing that today. Still doing that today in our own time. The dictionary defines a hero as a person who is admired or idealized for courage, outstanding achievements, or noble qualities. Jesus defines heroic love as loving each other as Christ has loved us. Jesus states that this heroic love is best displayed in our world by laying down our lives for others. What does laying down our lives mean? It certainly can mean the ultimate sacrifice, of giving up one's life so that others can live. As we celebrate Remembrance Day, we remember that those who have paid the ultimate sacrifice by giving up their lives so that we can live in freedom. As Christians, believers in Jesus, the cross is the visual reminder of our Savior displaying heroic love for us. Every time we witness heroic love around us, our hearts should be pointed to the cross as another reminder that heroic love comes to us in our lives from God, for love comes from God. What is the sign that we put over the graves of fallen soldiers who were followers of Jesus in life? What marks their grave? A cross. That marks that spot as a memorial of heroic love. When Jesus speaks of heroic love as laying down our lives for others, He is also referring to how we live every day of our lives. Shouldn't laying down our lives should be something in everyday life that we look to other people's interests above our own. I recently read the story of Maury Bogart, who is 92 years old. Even though confined to his bed, he would knit hats for the homeless. He passed away this past February, but it was reported he made over 8,000 hats in 15 years. Mr. Bogart could have focused on his limitations of being confined to bed, but instead he looked beyond himself and did what he could to place the needs of others before his own. Maury declared that doing this service made him feel good and gave him a purpose in life. He said, "I'm going to do this until I go home to be with the Lord." Heroic acts of love display God's purposes in our world. And therefore, when we love each other heroically, we join Jesus in God's purposes around us. Whether it's a soldier who shields innocent civilians from danger, to families who risk their own safety by hiding and helping strangers from occupying soldiers, or simply a young mother with an infant day and night after night changing diapers and going through many sleepless nights. Heroic love is all around us, and we need more of it in our world. I believe one of the greatest ways that we can honor the soldiers and military personnel who throughout Canadian history have displayed heroic love is to share heroic love in our everyday lives in remembrance of them. I love the biblical example of Gideon as God calling an ordinary person who's afraid to serve Him heroically. Gideon was alive at a time when his country was occupied by a foreign power, the Midianites. The people of God had forgotten of God's heroic love in bringing them to the promised land and begun to serve other gods that promoted self-interests over loving others. The Midianites had God's people so scared. What were they doing? They were living in the sides of cliffs while the Midianites were destroying everything in the country. Gideon himself is hiding his wheat in a wine press. When God encounters Gideon, addressing Gideon in a very unique way. Did you catch that in the text? While he is hiding from the enemy, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Who are you talking to, God? Gideon saw himself as anything but a mighty warrior. And he also doubted God being with him. Gideon saw the situation he was in as if God had abandoned his people. And Gideon was afraid and knew his weaknesses all too well. Gideon asked God a question that I believe all of us can very much resonate with at times in our lives. If the Lord is with us, why has this happened to us? The Lord responds not with answering his question, but calling Gideon to go in the strength you have and save the country from the Midianites. What strength is Gideon's response? The Lord empowers weak, scared people to do acts of heroic love. There's an inner strength that Gideon didn't see in himself that God provides. The great Christian leader Paul spoke about God's empowering in a letter to a Christian church in Corinth. Paul states, "Not many of you were wise by human standards when God called you to serve, or were you influential or of noble birth. But God chose," he says, "the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong." Humble, everyday people dealing with fears and enemies too strong for them to defeat on their own can be called by God to experience God's heroic love in our world. How does God show Gideon his heroic love? He has him defeat the Midianite army, which was described as thick as locusts, and with their camels couldn't be counted, just as you couldn't count the sand on the seashore, with 300 men, mighty warriors who were carrying trumpets and musical instruments. God could have had Gideon assemble a strong army and defeat the Midianites with a strong army, but then the people in Gideon would have thought that it was their own strength that helped them defeat the Midianites. God wanted scared, timid Gideon to be made into a mighty warrior who understood and knew the ultimate strength in life, that God was with him and his people. It was God's display of heroic love by defeating the Midianites with only 300 men with musical instruments and lights that displays God's power and constant presence in weak people's lives. How are we reminded that God is still with us today? We see heroic love through people who lay down their lives for the needs of others, even willing to pay the ultimate sacrifice of their own life. And we see the cross, where Jesus' words from John 15, verse 13, ring loud and clear in our own hearts. Greater love has no one than this, that they lay down their life for their friends. Will we pray? Lord, as we look to the cross, we're reminded of your love being with us in our weakest points in life. That you are a God who does not abandon his people, but stays with them, even showing your heroic love through others in our lives as well. May your heroic love continue to be alive in our hearts. May we as weak people still know your strength that empowers us this day. Help us to shine and share this heroic love in remembrance of you, and in remembrance of those who have given their lives as an ultimate sacrifice as well. And do this in remembrance of them. We ask this in your name, Jesus. Amen.